Last Week in Southern Labor is a segment that we do every week, courtesy of Jonah Furman. He does a newsletter called Who Gets the Bird that you can read at whogetsthebird.substack.com that goes over what happened in all of labor in the United States. Every week, he goes over what happened the last week in U.S. labor, and so we pull from that, with his permission, what happened in the South of the United States in the labor movement. And last week, in new organizing, we saw 1,100 workers who mostly make Reese's at Hershey's second largest plant in the United States in Stewart's Draft, Virginia. They're organizing with the BCTGM. BCTGM, I mean, in the last 2 or 3 years has really been on a roll. Bakery,
it's been busy.
Yeah, been busy. Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers International Union. They are organizing with the BCTGM. It is only the 25th or so 1,000 worker plus filing at the NLRB in the past 5 years. And of those, no non-healthcare or education workers have won. There has not been a single non-healthcare or education worker win that has been over 1,000 workers. So this would be an important victory. Local reporting has some of the details of the union drive as of November. 176 Starbucks workers across 8 states just last week. 170 and more have come out since this newsletter. 176 Starbucks workers just since last week across 8 stores, 1 in Memphis and 2 in Richmond in the South, have officially filed for elections with Workers United. And some of these are new announcements this week that are stores that waited to file the official paperwork after announcing. And 6 building cleaners at an office park that houses intelligence agencies in McLean, Virginia, are joining Operating Engineers Local 99.
That's interesting. I'm curious what they may find cleaning the building of the intelligence agency. Yeah, they might want to treat that union with respect.
Right.
Take care of those workers, because there's no telling what secrets they may hear and see.
In strikes and bargaining, the Warrior Met strike by 1,100 UMWA miners against metallurgical coal firm Warrior Met in Brookwood, Alabama continues, and Sarah Jones at New York Magazine has more.
Good to see mainstream press covering the issue.
Yep. Some new big strike threats have surfaced this week. First, on the railroads, the 17,000 BNSF workers with BLET, which is a Teamsters union, and SMART TD. These are all acronyms of unions, and I don't know what they stand for, who said they'd be moving towards a strike authorization vote, have in fact formally authorized a strike. Wow. Though BNSF is suing to put the brakes on it. BNSF is like the employer. They're suing to put the brakes on the strike, and the decision will apparently be made by a Trump appointee judge on Monday. Perhaps the bigger news is that the 11 union rail bargaining coordinated bargaining coalition. So there's an 11 union bargaining coalition of railroad workers called the Coordinated Bargaining Coalition. They are also moving in the direction of striking, covering 105,000 rail workers across major freight companies. I'd strongly recommend you to follow Labor Notes staff writer Joe DeManuel Hall's work on this, as he has been talking to rail workers and can explain the mysteries of the special labor law, the Railway Labor Act, which covers these workers. We're not as close to a strike as a normal strike authorization would mean because of the wonky way in which the Railway Labor Act works, but at the same time, railroad workers do seem to be at a breaking point.
And Jacob, I actually have an update on that. As Jonah mentioned, there was going to be a ruling in terms of the BNSF employees, and a federal judge ruled today, Tuesday, January 25th, that the union workers must go to arbitration over the new attendance policy, effectively blocking them from striking. So there again, we see where judges can be,
It's
on the side of management, and that's why it's always best if you can win your fights without having to go through the courts. One of the things I see has been cited by the judge. This is U.S. District Judge Mark T. Pittman of the Northern Texas District. By ruling in favor of the company, he also discussed how it would deprive shippers of transportation, hurt revenue, supposedly threaten the safety of the general public.
That's the point!
Yeah. So he acknowledged the tremendous power these workers have, and that was enough to, basically shoo them away, hope they will go to arbitration and all die down. So very, disappointing, but not necessarily surprising that the judge came down that way. I'm looking here, and it looks like the union and the company will be heading to mediation. And the new attendance policy was supposed to go into effect February 1st. So we'll see how that pans out. But yeah, very disappointing. Hate to see that, and just really hope that the union is able to I don't want to say bypass arbitration. They need to go through the process, but I hope that there is enough power and support inside the workforce and their allies to really put pressure on the company.
Yeah. Speaking of the Railway Labor Act, AFA CWA flight attendants at Piedmont Airlines, which is a mid-Atlantic regional carrier owned by American Airlines, they have a tentative agreement after authorizing a strike in October. Educators at Anacostia High School in Washington, D.C. held a job action on Friday, shutting down classes for the day over both violence and COVID-19 safety issues. Negotiations sound rocky with educators in Escambia County, Florida, and workers who make Corvette for GM in Bowling Green, Kentucky are also on the strike path, but nothing immediate as they are under the national GM agreement in addition to their local negotiations. In Virginia, a couple groups of public sector workers rallied for the fight to collectively bargain, a decision that is now up to local jurisdictions per the newish state law, which, by the way, local educators in Alabama, it is up to municipalities if they want to collectively bargain with you. There is no bar on collective bargaining in state law.
Right. There is no legal mechanism that says teachers in Madison City schools
cannot have a collective bargaining agreement.
Right. There's nothing barring a school board and superintendent from agreeing to a collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah.
With
just putting that out there. So just do with that information what you will. In Virginia Beach, Virginia, city workers with UE Local 111 pushed for a local ordinance, and United Campus Workers is making noise at Virginia Commonwealth University and the University of Virginia. After bargaining for a first contract at Dish Network since 2010.
Wow.
12 years bargaining for a first contract. Members of CWA Local 6171 in Crum, Texas, have a 2-year agreement.
That is ridiculous. And that's
wild.
That's why we talk a lot about our broken labor law system and why we need the PRO Act and why we need these other improvements. That's obscene. 12 years.
That's wild.
12 years. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, there are probably members of that local who had children around that time who are now in middle school.
Yeah. Wild.
Wow.
Wild.
But shout out to 6171 CWA for getting that contract.
MLB Players Association bargaining with the MLB resumed after a leisurely 6 weeks of no talking during an ongoing lockout. The lockout will, of course, be much more visible if it continues beyond the offseason and delays the March 31st season kickoff, which is increasingly likely.
Yeah, I based on what I followed with this, it looks like the owners wanted this to drag out.
Right.
They wanted it to impact spring training. I don't know how much of that is just pressure on the players, like physically, and and how much of it is to try to garner public support because, oh no, my games aren't on.
Right.
Those players get paid money, so I'm mad. I don't know. But hey, solidarity with the Major League Baseball players. They are selling their labor in exchange for a wage. Some of them quite nice wages, but some of them not so much. And they are, putting their bodies out there. So
right.
Support the players.
The three unions that represent Social Security Administration employees, AFGE, NTEU, and the Association of Administrative Law Judges, have all reached a return to in-person work agreement with their employer, the Social Security Administration. This comes after the Social Security Administration issuing a return-to-work order for January the 5th that was deemed unlawful because it was not bargained over. And so now they have a bargained-over return to in-person work agreement with their workers, and that's what being in a union workplace with a contract can get you. Your employer cannot unilaterally impose, we talked about this just last week, or maybe it was the week before, about how return to work is a mandatory subject of bargaining if you have a union contract. Your employer cannot arbitrarily change these things. That is what the Social Security Administration did despite having a contract in place, and so they were overruled. They acknowledged that, and they went to the bargaining table, and the workers were able to secure an agreement there. So that's good news. In politics, the Biden administration has enacted the $15 an hour minimum wage for all federal civilian employees, which affects 67,000 workers in a move that seemed kind of quiet. I didn't hear about it until I read the newsletter for an administration that is looking for bread and butter wins. Yeah. But 67,000 workers getting a raise? That's not bad.
Yeah, I had not seen this anywhere else.
I mean, the announcement of I think he signed the executive order doing this some time ago, but it has now been enacted, and you would think that they would be like,
hey, you ought to celebrate the signing of it and the enactment of it, right? You ought to really talk about that.
In an administration with so few victories, you should. You should be pushing the few victories that you have out.
And of course, $15 is not what $15 was 10 years ago as the Fight for 15 movement really started gaining steam. So I guess congratulations for almost keeping up with the inflation of the past year. Yeah.
The Biden administration is also expanding the H-2B visa program for 20,000 more non-agricultural workers, a move that, quote-unquote, the unions, per this Bloomberg Law article, which cites Unite Here and the AFL-CIO leaders, are pushing back on, which I wouldn't be surprised because there is opposition to some of the way that immigrant workers are brought in, mainly that they are tied to their employment. A lot of these immigrant workers on these H-2B visas they're tied to their, meaning they're brought in here, and if they lose their job, they're sent back. So, wow. I wonder what kind of incentive that creates for a worker who is in an abusive environment or an unsafe environment. I wonder what kind of incentives that has on their ability to report to the authorities illegal activities that's going on or to organize for a better workplace themselves. Man, I wonder what kind of incentive that puts on the worker.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing power dynamic there.
Yeah. And finally, the new Bureau of Labor Statistics unionization numbers came out this week, and they were predictably depressing, with 241,000 fewer union members now than there were a year ago, and 2 million fewer than there were 20 years ago, despite there being 14 million more workers added to the workforce in those 2 decades. 10.3% of U.S. workers are union, and 6.1% of workers in the private sector are union. There are tons of ways to slice and dice the data, but the punchline is the union movement, measured in the fundamental metric of organization, or membership, is continuing its downward trajectory. It also remains true that there are 14 million unionized workers in the country, which is a massive organizational and social base from which to build.
And something, I recall a comment recently on YouTube during one of our live episodes that kind of just responding to all the good news in terms of organizing wins and responding to this wave of strikes. And it was more or less, well, why are there still so few people joining unions? Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is 1 year is not going to undo decades upon decades. Certainly.
I would be interested in seeing what happens, what the numbers look like in 2 or 3 years, because a year is how long it can take a campaign to, you do oftentimes a year of organizing before you even file a petition, So,
I guess to tease out that question, that's the first answer is just historical trends. It's hard to undo that. Certainly in just a year's time. The other piece of it, of course, is the labor law system itself and how unfriendly that is to new organizing. You can also look at some of the weaknesses inside currently existing unions. And sometimes those can be their own worst enemy and not really help themselves in terms of recruiting and adding new organizing. But, I think the last statement there's still 14 million of us, and that's huge. And while it may be small in context, it's still a huge number of people who are engaged in the collective process of fighting for each other and for a better society.
Support for the Valley Labor Report comes from the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers Union. Learn more by visiting www.ifpte.org.